My pleasure to introduce. So I think one of the things about this movie is that, well, I think it is really useful to attach a set of people to a set of questions like this. My brother and my sister-in-law have a very strong set of opinions. And that strong set of opinions is informed by their experience, and it's valid, but it's not always the entire story. And there have been points where I've disagreed with what they think, and there are points that support regulations in other ways. And I think that there's the standpoint of someone who is justifiably desperate is not necessarily the only one we want to include when thinking about regulatory environments like this, because it's also one that makes you very vulnerable to manipulation by other groups. So I think there's a lot of different stuff to consider, and a big part of that is, why does the FDA do things this way? And there are reasons behind most of these things, but some of those reasons may have shifted or changed, and we might have cause for further discussion. So I invited Dr. Holly Fernandez Lynch, or Professor Holly Fernandez Lynch from UPenn, who is an attorney and an expert in this exact field of regulation, who's going to give us a just perspective on how the FDA came about, walk us through some case studies about interesting regulatory environments right now, and what the FDA is trying to do, or had previously been trying to do, to try to adjust to the new environment of science.
All right, well, thanks so much for joining us today, and thanks, Tom, for introducing us to that really powerful documentary about your family and other patients and families who are affected by this terrible disease. It's not only about ALS, of course, right? There are many terrible diseases with unmet treatment need that have patients asking, important questions about what is the role of the regulator, the Food and Drug Administration, in this context. And so that's what Tom asked me to talk to you all about today, right? Why do we have the FDA that we have? What types of flexibility are available for patients who are suffering from these diseases today? And how can we also make sure that we're developing really important and effective treatments for patients that get diagnosed in the future? Okay. So let me just share with you where I'm hoping to cover in about the next 45 minutes or so. I want to explain to you why we have the Food and Drug Administration, where it came from, and what the world was like before we had the Food and Drug Administration with its current regulatory authorities. And then I'm going to talk you through various flexibilities that FDA has and more recent proposals to push FDA to be even more flexible. And a lot of what I'm going to say aligns with what you saw in that documentary. And then some of the other things I'm going to say are going to push back on some of the pieces or some of the points that were made in the film. So the first point you can see here, a nice little graphic about red tape. There's often a concern that it is federal government bureaucracy that is preventing patients from accessing safe and effective drugs, right? As though there's kind of this pile of amazing new medicines behind a door somewhere at FDA, and these cold-hearted bureaucrats are just blocking patients from having access to things. There's some red tape, but there's not some secret, cabal trying to keep people away from safe and effective medicines, right? I think everyone is aligned in getting those medicines as quickly as possible to patients. And very often the challenge where we have unmet treatment need is that we really don't understand the diseases that we're trying to treat. And therefore we have repeated failures in clinical trials. So it could be that we don't understand the constellation of diseases, the constellation of factors kind of contributing to a disease. ALS, for example, like cancers, might actually be kind of a group of syndromes that affects patients differently. And then we also have challenges in designing trials for these domains. So the science is really hard. The first part of the documentary, right, about getting more money for these diseases so that we can do basic science that's necessary for drug development, I couldn't be behind that more strongly, right? Like that is absolutely where we need to be pushing. And I'll get to it towards the end, but I'll just say right now, kind of with the decimation of NIH, that's not what we need, right? That is not how we're going to be able to develop safe and effective medicines. Once we have strong medicines, FDA is very easily able to approve them. And what I hope to share with you today are the ways that FDA has bent over backwards in a number of examples to get products to patients even before they have been proven effective. So just to situate FDA kind of where it lives within the federal government, it's part of the executive branch. It's within the Department of Health and Human Services. It's led by a political appointee, right? It is not an independent agency. The president, when he gets elected, picks a new head of FDA, and they get confirmed by the Senate. And that has some challenges associated with it. On the one hand, it allows FDA to be responsive democratically to the kind of policy positions that the public wants the agency to have. If we think about this pendulum between speed and certainty, FDA can respond democratically. But they have a number of authorities. The one that's most relevant to this conversation has to do with whether or not a new drug will be made available on the market to patients. And then they also get their money through a combination of factors. So one is congressional appropriations, and another is through user fees that are paid by regulated industry, right? So the drug companies that want their products approved when they file their materials also pay part of FDA's budget. So when I teach this to my students, we can spend a whole 2 hours on just this one slide. I'm not going to go into detail on FDA history, but I want you to kind of understand that if you go back, a century and a quarter, there was no federal government regulation of new drugs. Instead, drugs were regulated by the states. It was kind of just up to, patients to buy what they wanted on the open market, for doctors to kind of give them advice. And the sorts of things that were available on the market were often very dangerous, and people had no idea what they were actually taking. So some examples here: Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was widely marketed in the end of the 1800s, early 1900s as a cure-all for colicky babies, or kind of a babies who are teething. The ingredient in it was morphine. Right? The amount of medicine in a teaspoon would be enough to kill a toddler, and many babies died as a result of this medicine being available on the market. Right? You've heard the phrase snake oil salesman. Snake oil was a real thing, didn't actually contain any snake oil. And what you can't see, I had to cut out to fit on the slide, was all sorts of claims, right, being made about this product. And so there was we don't have time to go into it, but a policy window opened around the turn of the 20th century where Congress kind of stepped in and said, look, we at least need to have some regulation of the kind of claims that are getting made around products, and we need people to understand what are the ingredients in these products so they know whether they should stay away from them. So the very first kind of foray into federal regulation of drugs was the 1906 Pure Food and Drugs Act, which prohibited adulteration, right, meaning you can't have contamination of the products, and it also prohibited misbranding, right, so you couldn't have false or misleading labeling on your products, but there was no requirement to prove that they were safe. There was no kind of pre-approval requirement where you would submit something to the federal government and they would give a seal of approval. And then, FDA's history has kind of been marked by response to tragedy. If you fast forward a couple of decades to the 1930s, we see the elixir of sulfanilamide disaster. I don't know if folks are familiar with this, but basically this was a product that was widely used for treatment of strep throat, sore throat, and it was in a pill form that was hard for children to swallow. And so the company thought, well, why don't we make it in a liquid form so kids will be able to take it? They tested it for smell, they tested it for taste, but they didn't test it for safety. And the solvent they used was diethylene glycol, which also is found in antifreeze. It's not something you want to put in a medicine. And over 100 children died as a result of this product being allowed on the market. And so Congress, again, stepped in and said, all right, let's make sure that the products that are available for purchase are safe for their intended use. So we get our first pre-market requirement where you would have to submit something to the Food and Drug Administration. They would have to agree that it was safe before it could be marketed. And then if we go forward a couple of additional decades, we get our effectiveness requirement. And this was a response to the thalidomide tragedy in which in Europe, right, this drug was being pursued as a treatment for morning sickness, right, associated with pregnancy. Unfortunately, it causes, terrible developmental deformities in children that are born to women who took this product. It was not approved in the United States because this woman, Frances Kelsey, who you see getting acknowledged by JFK, stopped it from getting approved through the Food and Drug Administration, right? Preventing really serious harmful impact here in the US. So even that was a safety consideration. It opened up another policy window for Congress to give FDA additional authority. And this is the standard that's in place today. You have to submit a marketing application for a new drug to the Food and Drug Administration demonstrating that a new product is safe and effective for its intended use. And you have to wait for FDA to give you the green light before you can market it. So over the course of the 20th century, right, with this additional kind of statutory authority, what we see is that we have increased certainty about the products that are coming on the market. But in order to generate evidence of safety and effectiveness, then we slow things down, right? It's decreased speed to market, but we have more confidence that those products are going to be ones that we actually want to use. A very brief kind of sidebar here about dietary supplements, just to understand that they are different in their regulation compared to what I'm calling new drugs. So this is the definition of a drug in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. It's a substance that's intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, or a substance that's intended to affect the structure or function of the body. And the reason intended to is underlined on these slides is because what FDA is regulating are the claims that are made about the product. So you could have the same exact chemical entity with different claims being made about it, and some claims will be drug claims and other claims won't be, right? And so if you ever go into a GNC or a vitamin shop or something, or the Target vitamin aisle, and you pick up one of these bottles, you'll see these disclaimers on the back, right? This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. They're basically disclaiming we're not a drug. Dietary supplements don't really get regulated. They make these kind of wild claims often, but they have not been proven through clinical trial evidence. And that's the difference, right? For a new drug, we actually have evidence that these things work. So let me kind of explain why I think FDA is a really important agency. I didn't come up with these on my own. This is kind of like floating around in the FDA scholarship. The very first argument is just a paternalistic argument, and that's one that I think patients can appropriately push back on. But the idea here is simply the government has a responsibility to keep people safe, even if there are things that people might want to do that are unsafe, right? And so we have the FDA that is responsible for keeping bad products off the market. But I think the other domains here are even more important. So one is information asymmetry. Who in this audience is a clinician writing prescriptions or will be a clinician, right? Do you know like everything about every drug that you prescribe? Could you possibly know everything about every drug that like all the trials, all the data, right? Could you go through with a fine-tooth comb all of that information?
As a fellowship director, I'm going to say yes to the mistake, but no.
Right, you couldn't possibly, right? And so what FDA can help with is saying, well, we've done that. Right? We have the expertise. We've gone line by line through the clinical trial evidence. Our statisticians have rerun the numbers. We've evaluated this, and we're confident that it meets an appropriate standard of safety and effectiveness. So all you need to know is that the drug is approved, and you can look at the label, and you can have kind of summary information about which patients it might be good for, and you can keep up with the medical literature if you want to engage in off-label prescribing, but you can rely on us. Right? You're just kind of like dividing the labor so that you don't have to become an expert in every drug that you might want to prescribe. FDA also plays a really important function in promoting innovation. So if you are a new chemical entity and you get FDA approval, you are granted exclusivity in which FDA will not approve the same product for the same indication for 5 years. That's important, right? You keep your competitors off the market. We can have a whole other conversation about impact on price, impact on access, but you generate interest in innovation by saying, if you invest in a product that is first to market and you do all of that work to get it there, you are going to get a financial reward. And FDA kind of stands as the gatekeeper to that. And then this is my favorite one at the bottom. We see what happens, for example, in the world of dietary supplements, where there is no regulatory requirement to prove that those things work, and therefore we don't have the proof that they work. What FDA does as a gatekeeper of which products are allowed on the market is say to companies, if you want to profit, you must produce the evidence that clinicians and their patients need to decide whether these are things that they want to try. This is something that the market does not force in and of itself. It is the fact that we have a government agency standing in between profits, right, and the company that allows us to get the evidence that all patients need. And I think that one really stands in contrast to the paternalism argument. To make autonomous decisions about your treatment, you actually need information, right? You can't make autonomous decisions in the dark. And so in addition to paternalism, I think there's an autonomy supporting role that FDA plays. I don't work for FDA. I just think they play an important role. Okay, but I will be, first to acknowledge that yes, great, FDA keeps bad stuff off the market, but some patients are going to die waiting. And we just saw, right, how real that is to patients. Sandy Morris, who was on that video, has passed away. Chris Snow, who was on the video, has passed away, right? This is really, really time sensitive. Now, this is not a new issue. Since FDA has had the authority to hold drugs off the market until they give sufficient evidence of safety and effectiveness, there have been patients pushing back on that requirement. And in fact, there's a colleague of mine has written a book. His name is Louis Grossman, and the book is called Choose Your Medicine, that is about the history of pushing back on FDA since the earliest days of its existence to say, let us take what we want. What you see on the screen here is a lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court in the late 1970s, brought by terminally ill cancer patients who sued to stop the government from interfering with interstate shipment and sale of a product called Laetrile. People heard of Laetrile? Laetrile was derived from apricot pits. And there, you see a book here, right? There was kind of this movement around Laetrile as this miracle drug that was going to cure cancer. It doesn't cure cancer. But there were many, many patients who wanted access to it. It was not an FDA-approved drug. I can't remember the specific details. I believe you could buy it out, from outside the country. And so what they wanted access to it within the United States. And they sued the government saying, let us have access. Now, this was, not too long after the 1962 amendments that I mentioned previously, in which FDA got the authority to require drugs to be both safe and effective. The lower courts found the patient's arguments convincing. They said, well, maybe Laetrile is exempt. It's not really a new drug, and so we're not going to, hold it to the same requirements. The lower court said, well, maybe there's a constitutionally protected privacy interest of terminally ill patients in accessing this drug, and the government's interfering with it. And they said, these patients are dying, and so what does it mean for a product to be safe and effective? Maybe they should just be allowed to try. When it got to the Supreme Court, they said no, right? That none of those arguments are valid. There's no exception to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act requirement for safety and effectiveness, no exception for drugs that are used by terminally ill patients. And they went through the rationale basically saying, it wasn't that Congress was only trying to protect patients with curable diseases or non-serious diseases. The safety and effectiveness requirement is important even for dying patients, right? A product could be unsafe for someone who has a terminally ill disorder or condition, and it could expedite their death. And the effectiveness requirement is also important because we might worry that people are going to waste their time, their money, the last opportunities that they have pursuing products that really are not effective. And so this, to this day, is the law of the land, right? That the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act applies even for products intended to treat terminal patients. There was subsequent litigation couple of decades later. This is a young woman named Abigail Burroughs. She ended up dying of her cancer, but she and her family petitioned FDA to develop a new approach to approving products intended to treat serious diseases, where the idea would be that FDA would grant initial approval for promising drugs. And FDA denied that petition, and they said, like, this is our statutory standard. We have to follow the statute. We don't have the statutory authority to approve products before they've met the standard for safety and effectiveness. And so Abigail's family then sued the FDA. This case did not make its way to the Supreme Court. It did make its way to the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. And this was the question that they were considering. Do terminally ill patients with no remaining treatment options have a constitutionally protected liberty interest in seeking access to investigational medicines, right? Is the FDA inhibiting a constitutionally protected right of these patients to try to save their own lives? And what the DC Circuit Court of Appeals said was no. The way, I'm not going to go into a long detail about this, but what it means to have a constitutionally protected right is that there's a foundational, fundamental liberty interest that's deeply rooted in our nation's history and tradition, and would inhibit kind of ordered justice and liberty if you were to infringe on that. And so the court basically said, look, FDA has been around for a century at this point. They have been granted additional authority by Congress for good reason over several decades. There is no fundamental constitutionally protected interest to try whatever you want. And since it's not a constitutionally protected right, the standard that the court applies is just a rational basis standard. Does the government have any rational basis for the law that it's applying? And the court here said, yes, there is a rational basis to make sure that products are safe and effective before any patient has access to them, for the reasons that we've already kind of gone over. Now, in between Rutherford and Abigail Alliance, we saw a major patient advocacy movement, which has some reminiscence to what you saw on the video, right? The red tape, right? The tape over the mouth. These were protests on the steps of FDA and on the steps of NIH, where HIV/AIDS patient advocates in the late 80s and early 90s were pushing back against the government, saying, you are killing us by preventing us from accessing these promising interventions. And they were very successful in changing the dialogue and changing the expectations around how FDA would do its job. And what they succeeded in doing is shifting FDA from saying, we protect patients by preventing bad things from happening to them, like we prevent unsafe medicines from coming to the market, to not abandoning that, but saying we also have an obligation to help facilitate access to things that might be safe and effective, right? So it's not just focused on protection, it's also now trying to facilitate access. And we're gonna talk about two really important success stories out of the HIV advocacy movement. The first is expanded access, and the second is accelerated approval. So expanded access is happening in the domain before FDA has granted marketing approval to a product. You might also hear it referred to as compassionate use, but the regulatory term is expanded access. Now, what it does is allow patients who have a serious or immediately life-threatening disease or condition, and they have no satisfactory comparable alternatives, and accessing that product, the benefits or the likely benefits outweigh the risks. If all of those things are satisfied and the patient cannot participate in a trial of that product, FDA will allow them to access that drug before it has been granted approval. Okay, so it's happening in this gap area. You're not in a trial. You can't yet get the drug through a prescription from your clinician, but you might benefit from it and you don't have any other good treatment options. What you heard in the documentary about ACT for ALS had a provision in it, has still a provision in it, in which the federal government sets aside money to fund research use of expanded access data, right? Because we're going to talk in a minute, this is wonderful on paper, but there's lots of reasons why it might still not be accessible to patients who could potentially benefit from it. But this has been around for several decades now. I didn't leave these slides in here, but what you should know is not that many patients are gaining access through the expanded access pathway. It's typically, you can get the data on FDA's website, it's typically in the realm of like 1,000 to 2,000 patients a year who are getting expanded access. The numbers were way out of whack during COVID because there was the largest ever expanded access program for convalescent plasma to treat COVID, but typically the numbers are quite low. This is a pretty regulated pathway, and lots of different gatekeepers have to say yes. Obviously, the patient has to be willing to pursue an unapproved product. Their doctor has to think it's a good idea. Their doctor has to fill out some paperwork to FDA. And the doctor will also help them navigate asking the company for access. Although, savvy patients can also go directly to the company. The company can say yes, but they are not legally required to say yes, and they often say no. FDA has to say yes. FDA almost always, literally almost always, 99% of the time, says yes. The reasons that FDA might say no might be, oh, actually there's a trial you can participate in, or, oh, we don't think this product has any chance of benefiting you, and here are all of the reasons why. But in the vast majority of cases, they are saying yes. And then an institutional review board also has to sign off, right? So it's lots of steps along the way, but it can happen rapidly. There's a process for emergency expanded access. The challenges, of course, are that lots of people don't even know that expanded access exists. So if you're at a major academic medical center like Penn, where I am, for example, you've got the clinicians who are also running the trials. They know what's coming down the pipeline. They know what might be a good option for their patients, right? At community hospitals where you have less research happening, there might not be the same level of awareness of products that could potentially be beneficial, or even awareness that this pathway exists. And it's something that requires more effort and engagement on the part of the clinician, right? The already busy clinician has to fill out the paperwork, liaise with the company, liaise with FDA, and try to get this through. And then we also might be worried that the company is going to say no. Some of the reasons that companies say no are completely legitimate. They think the product is not likely to benefit that patient, or they have only manufactured enough of the product to run the clinical trial and they don't have enough to give it to people outside the study. Or they are a very small company and they literally don't have the staff bandwidth to manage the requests that are coming in. Or they just say, we're small, we have no approved products. The best way to help the most patients is to get our drug approved, and anything else in the way is going to deviate from that goal. So we're just not going to allow expanded access at all. Bigger companies, right, the Biogens of the world, the J&Js of the world, are able to have pretty robust expanded access programs. You can get expanded access really at any point along the way, starting, even before phase 1. If you've got promising animal studies, it is plausible that FDA could say yes. But what most often happens is expanded access is used in that bridge period between when you finish your pivotal trials and you are waiting for FDA to approve the product, right? So the sponsor, the company, has put in their approval materials to FDA. They're pretty confident that it's going to get approved, or you're not going to submit your materials to FDA. And so you allow the patients who were in the studies to keep taking the drug in that gap period. But it doesn't always work out that way. You saw in the documentary, right? Some patients wanted to continue use, and that option wasn't available to them. And then the other really important aspect here is the cost, right? So FDA does have a provision that allows companies to charge for investigational drugs, but they can't profit from those drugs. So you can charge the direct cost of making it available. The problem with that is, before FDA approval, no insurer is going to pay for it. because it hasn't yet met the bar of being deemed safe and effective. So it's highly unlikely you're going to get insurers to pay, and most patients do not have the out-of-pocket ability to pay for these investigational drugs on their own. So what you'll typically see is that the bigger companies will just make it available free of charge, and the smaller companies have difficulty doing that. That's one of the things that Act for ALS was intended to address, is to say, here, we'll put aside some funds so that you can make expanded access available. And then I'll just flag a kind of more recent development. Can't quite say it's building on expanded access. It's kind of an alternative pathway to expanded access. This was also something that was heavily pushed by the ALS patient advocacy community, the Federal Right to Try Act. This started at the state level, and the idea was that if you and your doctor and the company agreed that an investigational drug might be beneficial to you, then you could gain access without going through FDA's expanded access pathway. It sounds really great on paper, right to try, right? You've got these dying patients who might benefit from these products. But I and others, other ethicists in particular, really argued that this was a solution in search of a problem. The reasons that patients were not getting access was not because FDA was standing in the way. And so all this did was take FDA out of the loop. It has not been widely used. It really has not improved patient ability to access investigational drugs. Let me pause there for any questions before I move on to the next part of the talk. So this was all about how patients can gain access. They could be in a trial, they could pursue expanded access, they might pursue right to try. These are some of the flexibilities that are available. Yeah, Tom.
I'm curious how much literature there is about where the key breakpoints are in both of these processes.
Yeah.
In right to try, a lot of it has to do with there's no money set aside to pay for it, so you got to raise GoFundMe and everything else like that. But it is always surprising to me how few people take advantage of early access. And my suspicion, so I was saying, it's surprising to me how few people take advantage of early access, and my suspicion is it has a lot to do with what you mentioned, which is absent physician awareness. I'm just curious if we know that or are left making our best guess.
There's some evidence that it's lack of awareness, and FDA has a program that I believe started in 2018. I can't remember the exact date, called Project Facilitate. Like many other kind of innovative FDA approaches, this was born out of the Oncology Center of Excellence. So this is it's a project called Pilot Facilitate, run out of OCE, and their whole goal is to streamline the application process and improve awareness around the fact that expanded access is a possibility, because so many people are not aware of it. And so they have a hotline. You can get an actual person from FDA on the, or you could, I don't know, maybe they're not there anymore, right? But the idea was that you could get people on the phone and they would walk you through, as a clinician or as a patient, the steps you needed to follow in order to be able to do that. I think part of the there's I think a number of reasons that are not on here, right? One might be there's just not good drugs available to you, right? That would be helpful for expanded access. The companies, I think, are very often saying no. We don't have good data on that. Companies don't have to publicly report how many expanded access requests they get, how many they say yes or no to. Some companies do, bigger companies voluntarily make that available. The only thing that they're required to do by law is post online what their expanded access policy is, and their policy might just be, no, we don't do it. Yeah.
Hi, great talk. My name is Shazib. I'm one of the fellows that work for Dr. Wallach. And so I think you briefly touched upon this, but so that one patient who was getting some sort of therapy during trial and then stopped, what is the reason for not getting continued therapy when it was clearly working?
Okay, so two things. I'm not sure that it was clearly working. It would be very hard to tell that from any single patient. And I mean, although in these examples, right, you did see some stories of people saying, like, I could get up out of my wheelchair, right? And they couldn't before, right? So you see these kind of Lazarus type effects, and you say, okay, like maybe it really is working for this patient. There's no legal obligation for that company to continue providing access outside their designed trial. And in fact, even in their trial, there's no legal obligation for them to continue it. So in that particular example, I don't know the ins and outs of why the company refused to continue providing access. Tom might know more details about this. There was a lot of pressure from the patient community on that company to continue providing access. I think there were financial claims that they couldn't continue doing it. But yeah, why don't you say more?
So part of that is that specific case was, I believe, a hybrid phase 1/2. So it was not necessarily designed to assess treatment efficacy, but safety with a little bit of treatment outcomes, which they will do for small and rare disease trials. But the other part of it was, as they mentioned, one of the issues for that company was just not having great study designs. And so they had set up a couple different things that left them with those situations a lot. And it was a little bit of a challenge. So it's a combination of the corporate behavior and the regulatory challenge of getting it.
The other thing that I'll say, though, just kind of from an ethical perspective, there's no legal obligation to make provisions for post-trial access when the study is over. But from an ethical perspective, it's something that we talk about all the time, right? That when you go into your study, you need to have a plan for what are you going to do for these patients if it works out for them. Are you going to continue providing them access? It becomes very dicey, right? Because what if you have something that patients need to keep taking for life? Do we expect the company to continue providing it? What are the parameters about when you, as a company, could legitimately stop? But you need to have some plan, and that plan should not be coming as a surprise to the people who agreed to participate in your study in the first place. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know if this is a time for just questions or like a more broader.
I have lots more, but like we can also just
discussion.
talk.
But like, I mean, so the way I look at it is, go back 500 years from where we are today with all of our setups and our organizations and our institutions, in a world where you know there's disease and there's people, there's scientists who are coming up with treatments at that time as well. And imagine there's something that maybe works for somebody who might not have as much time, and they want it, like as an autonomous individual. Like, how can we stop that individual from trying it out on themselves when it's something that they want? Like, for instance, like I was just thinking of a good analogy to think this through. And for instance, if a part of your house was on fire, let's say like, you know, like a small portion of your house is on fire, and that fire is slowly creeping, like it's increasing, and you have a bucket which might have water or might have like, I don't know, oil or gas that might, and you don't have anything else, and the fire is continuing to grow. Are you gonna take the chance to put it out when you're pretty sure that's water, or are you just gonna think that it might be oil and you're just gonna let that fire take the entire house down?
I'm going to take a second and have Professor Lynch go back to the talk, because I think that is the precise question we're trying to get at, and then we're going to talk about that when it's done.
Yeah.
But that is, I think, the precise crux of the dilemma, is where do we say this? And there are complicated metasystems around there that make it more challenging than just, oh, should you have that? But there are questions there. I think that's what we're trying to get at.
Yeah, I think that's the foundational question. And what I'll give you is kind of food for thought for framing the rest of the talk, is the difference between what's reasonable for an individual patient to do versus the responsibility of the regulator, which stands in a kind of public health role for making decisions across the population for current and for future patients. Okay, so I just went through kind of what's available to patients before FDA approval. The other thing that the HIV advocates were so successful in was pushing for alternative pathways to market, right? So I've called that here lower standards for market access. And to understand what makes them lower, you need to understand what the regular pathway is for FDA approval. So this statutory section here, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, Section 505, is the standard for approving a new drug. And the idea is that you have to produce evidence that the drug is safe for use and effective for use. Biologic products are regulated under a different statute, so rather than safe and effective, they have to be demonstrated to be safe, pure, and potent. It's the same deal, right? Safe and effective. And so the statute lists out reasons that FDA can refuse to grant approval to a new drug application. So one is on the safety side. There's just inadequate or insufficient information to show that the drug is safe, or the results actually show it's unsafe, right? So not enough information, or it's actually shown to be unsafe. On the effectiveness side, we look at whether there is substantial evidence that the drug will have its purported effect under labeled conditions. And what I mean by that is, for this population, under this dose, with this use, right, the on-label indication, will the drug be beneficial? And then that substantial evidence standard is further defined in statute as evidence consisting of adequate and well-controlled clinical investigations. Sometimes I highlight that S because it is plural, right? And so traditionally, it has been at least 2 adequate and well-controlled clinical investigations to support efficacy, or effectiveness, I should say, right? And so, this is where we're talking about pivotal studies, pivotal trials that support FDA approval. And that phrase, adequate and well-controlled, refers to the quality of evidence, right, adequate and well-controlled, and the quantity, investigations. And the goal here is to just figure out, does the drug effect that we think we're seeing, is it actually coming from the drug, or is there some just kind of spontaneous change happening in the patient? Right? We need to differentiate from the placebo effect or our other biases. That's the regular standard for approval. There is an alternative pathway called accelerated approval, and it still is a way to meet the substantial evidence standard, but rather than granting approval based on clinical endpoints, which are how the patient feels, functions, or survives, right? Things that you could just see or the patient can feel without having a lab test or, a scan. Rather than those clinical endpoints, we look at unvalidated surrogate endpoints or intermediate clinical endpoints that are reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. Okay, that's a lot of jargon, right? But basically, under the regular approval standard, we're pretty confident that the drug is effective with regard to how the patient feels, functions, or survives. For accelerated approval, we're not yet sure, but we're looking at an alternative endpoint that seems likely to predict that clinical benefit that we really care about. Okay, so it's an earlier pathway to market, and because it's a weaker standard of evidence on which you're allowing products to come to market, it's paired with some post-market requirements and other kind of limitations. So you can only get accelerated approval for drugs to treat serious or life-threatening diseases or conditions. And FDA requires post-market studies, right, after approval to confirm that that predicted benefit is real, right? So we actually need to figure out, does this drug work the way that it's expected to? And if those confirmatory studies fail to show benefit, then there's supposed to be this expedited pathway to withdraw approval. Any questions just kind of about like the basics of how accelerated approval works? Okay. They both allow the product on the market. You can prescribe it, right? It is on the label whether something has had accelerated approval, but often the patients have no idea. Often the clinicians don't really know, right, that it was accelerated approval. And it is weaker evidence. So as you can see, right, in the early 90s, accelerated approval was largely being used for HIV drugs, and it increasingly has been used for oncology drugs. And then we've seen even more recently that it's starting to be used for rare disease or even novel large markets like Alzheimer's disease. So you saw in the video, right, that we had the first ever accelerated approval in ALS just in the past couple of years. But for a long time, the ALS patient advocacy community would say, accelerated approval doesn't work for us because we don't even have a reasonably likely surrogate endpoint to rely on, right? You need to have something to hang your hat on, and some patients don't, some disease areas don't even have that. Who you see on the screen here is Peter Marks. Up until a couple of weeks ago, he was the head of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. the part of FDA that's responsible for overseeing vaccines and gene therapies, right, the biological products. And he was really known for being flexible, particularly in the context of rare disease. We're going to talk about some of his decisions in just a moment. But he was quoted in 2024 as saying accelerated approval is going to become the norm for gene therapies. And if you think about, right, what the way gene therapies work, you might need a long time to figure out whether they are in fact curing the patient, right? Maybe the gene therapy is making some new some protein that otherwise is not going to be produced properly in the patient. But you have to wait a while to figure out whether it's actually having the intended benefit. So that was the idea. But now we have a new head of CBER, a firebrand, I think it's appropriate to call him, Vinay Prasad, who actually for a long time pre-COVID had been kind of a staunch critic of the accelerated approval pathway as allowing products on the market with insufficient evidence. But also during COVID, he was really pushing back against COVID vaccines, not having enough evidence behind them, and pushing back against some of the public health decisions that were made in the context of COVID. So he just in the past couple of weeks has taken over this role, I think, throwing some uncertainty into the mix about how flexible and whether the trends of flexibility will continue at FDA. So let me just kind of walk you through what we know about accelerated approval. It does have the really important benefit of allowing great drugs on the market sooner than they would otherwise be available. A lot of the stats you're going to see on these slides come from oncology because that's where it's been most heavily studied. And so what this is showing, just to like give you a little bit more detail here, in this column is the time between accelerated approval and verification of benefit in years. Right? So we could also quibble about what it means to actually verify benefit. But basically, this is when the confirmatory studies were done. And you see there's a pretty wide range between 1 year and more than 6.5 years for products being available to patients that worked. Right? So you're getting those drugs to patients sooner. That's the way accelerated approval is supposed to work. But there's also a number of concerns. One is, this was some work that some colleagues of mine did looking through electronic health records to see what proportion of patients were started on accelerated approval oncology drugs and had those drugs ultimately withdrawn because they turned out not to work. And their data indicated that among 5 common oncology indications, more than a quarter of eligible treatment initiations involved an indication that was subsequently withdrawn for lack of benefit. Right, so to get to your point, that doesn't mean those patients would have said, no, we don't want to try, right? Maybe it was a legitimate, reasonable thing to do. But we've got, a quarter of patients starting something that turns out not to be beneficial, and definitely in this context have side effects associated with it. There's also concern about how long accelerated approval drugs are allowed to stay on the market before they, in fact, confirm benefit. So again, this is looking at oncology drugs. And what these researchers did was take the drugs that were approved and went out 5 years after the approval date or longer to see by the 5-year mark, how many of those oncology accelerated approvals had in fact shown survival benefit or improved quality of life, right? Like those are the things that we really care about in the cancer space or for many, serious and life-threatening illnesses. And what they found, right, was that many cancer drugs that were granted accelerated approval could not show benefit on overall survival or quality of life even 5 years after accelerated approval. And of course, these things are not free. And so that's not for the patients themselves to worry about, but for us, kind of as a community, we need to think about how these things are going to impact, certainly public benefits, but also kind of shared insurance funds. So just in the interest of time, I'll draw your attention to this one down here. This was generated from an Office of the Inspector General report that came out in 2022. And basically what it showed is in the period between 2018 and 2021, just looking at accelerated approval drugs that had not yet completed their confirmatory trials and were delayed, right? So FDA set a deadline, the companies blew past that deadline, right? So these have been on the market, were supposed to have been confirmed, and they hadn't yet been. Just in that period of time, cost the government $18 billion, right, for drugs that might not turn out to benefit anyone. So to summarize, right, some of these concerns that we see around accelerated approval, sometimes they're granted on surrogate endpoints that are not even reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. Sometimes, accelerated approval is granted even though the drugs were studied on clinical endpoints and they fail to meet the clinical endpoints, but then you look at the surrogate endpoints and you say, well, maybe there's some way to rescue this drug. But the idea was supposed to be that it would take too long to study the drug against clinical endpoints, and so you're only going to look at the surrogates because that's faster. So there's some concern around that. Lots of concern about the confirmatory studies. Are they done quickly enough? Are they done in a rigorous way that would actually confirm benefit? And some of these things FDA has tightened up in the past couple of years. They've been more willing to push companies to voluntarily withdraw drugs that fail to confirm benefit. But a lot of these concerns remain today. Let me just share a little bit more. I have a couple of cases that we can talk through together. But I want you to also recognize, particularly in contrast to some of what you were seeing on the video, FDA does exert flexibility in lots and lots of different ways. So one is the accelerated approval pathway. But then outside of accelerated approval, FDA will sometimes approve drugs based on less evidence than would traditionally be expected. So they might grant approval based on just one pivotal study rather than 2 pivotal studies, which is supposed to be the norm. And increasingly, they're accepting weaker evidence of benefit. And you can understand why, right? I'm just kind of like pointing out the kind of facts of how FDA is making its decisions and what the data show. But this, I think, is an important quote from a 2019 draft guidance where FDA says, look, sometimes it's acceptable to risk false positives and get those potentially beneficial drugs to patients more quickly, rather than risk a false negative, meaning failing to approve a drug that could be beneficial to patients. And they've repeatedly acknowledged, right, that patients are willing to accept some risk in order to gain access to products more quickly. And by risk, I'm referring both to safety risk, but also just like risk of uncertainty about whether the products work. We see FDA granting approval on the basis of phase 2 data without waiting for phase 3 studies, and an increasing use of single-arm studies, right? So not randomized controlled designs. And then we also see FDA granting approval even when it's not clear that the products have clinically meaningful benefit. So yes, they hit their endpoints to a statistically significant degree, but maybe doctors and patients wouldn't even be able to see the difference in those patients. The important thing to know about this type of flexibility is, unlike accelerated approval where we say, all right, we'll accept some uncertainty to let you on the market, but you better prove it later, this is just regular approval, no further confirmatory study requirements, they're just on the market, okay? And then I did want to just flag here, like FDA has these flexibilities available, but it doesn't always make use of them. The Oncology Center of Excellence is well known for being like the most flexible across FDA. The Neurology Division has gotten a reputation for being quite flexible. Tom will tell you, right, not every division or center within FDA works with the same level of flexibility. Okay, so this is just kind of more statistics about what I was showing you. I think if we kind of characterize where we've come from like the 1960s to today, we actually have flipped, right? So that there is more focus on getting drugs to patients quickly and a willingness to accept less certainty about those products. Now, I want to get to your point, right? Why is this a big deal? Maybe we should just say, let patients do what they want, or at least be just guided by their clinicians. I think it's a concern for patients today because they need information, right, if they can get it, about whether they should be willing to take a new drug. Patients, especially those who are facing serious diseases, are at pretty high risk for exploitation. And I recognize that that sounds quite paternalistic, but I just could point you to like the stem cell market, or go online and look at some of the things that people are doing GoFundMe's for in the rare disease or serious disease space. There are all sorts of things out there that are very unlikely to help patients, cost huge amounts of money, right? You see patients, taking second and third mortgages on their homes, depleting their life savings for things that are almost certainly not going to work for them. And so making sure that companies have their feet held to the fire to actually prove that their products work, I think is pretty important. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that there are some opportunity costs here. You could, pursue a new product that requires you to go to the hospital and stay in the hospital for a long period of time when you otherwise might not be doing that, and you would choose other ways to kind of spend out your final days. You might pursue an approved product that's not certain rather than participating in a trial of a new drug that could be even better, right? So I don't mean to suggest that these are easy decisions. I just mean to suggest that there are decisions, right, that need to be made here, about which it would be very helpful to have more information rather than less. That said, it makes all the sense in the world to me that a patient who is dying of ALS or a similar disease would say, let me at it, right? I want to have access to those drugs. The risk benefit to me is very clear. But FDA has to make decisions also for the patients that are coming down the pike. And what we really couldn't accept is the same level of uncertainty today being here 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, so that a decade from now we're still in the same place with patients saying, I don't know, I guess I have no choice but to try these things, because we haven't forced companies to produce the evidence that they need. So if we have low approval standards, that really weakens what we're expecting of companies. And we'll have, lots of drugs that get approved without those drugs being proven to be beneficial. And then this can sometimes be easy to slip through this reason. If you have a bunch of drugs on the market that look promising but have not been demonstrated to be beneficial, how are you going to design your study for the next drug? Are you going to be able to just do new drug versus placebo? Or is the standard of care going to have changed where all the patients are going to want access to that new but unproven product? So now you're testing new drug A that just got accelerated approval or something but isn't yet proven against new drug B. You don't know whether either one of them works. That's not a very good trial design. It's going to be impossible, really, for you to do that study without meeting the new standard of care. And so it can actually slow down the development of potentially better products if we weaken approval standards. And then, we've got these financial concerns, which I'm happy to kind of put to the side because I think they're of a different kind. So, Tom, I was thinking we could just walk through some of the case studies that I have here, but I'm happy for folks to jump in at any time. But do you want to participate in these? How do you want to do it? Okay.
Thank you again, Holly, for that talk. I think that was just a great summary of all the reasons why we really do need regulation. And I think most of us have encountered that dealing with supplements, right? Because how many times are you like, what's actually in this? And the reason we don't have regulations in supplements is because of a specific set of senators from Utah for the most part. But I also appreciate highlighting that so many of these things exist. But one thing that throws me, and I think we'll see this in some of these case studies, is what you mentioned, which is the lack of standardization across the divisions of the FDA. There at least used to be a lot of divisions in the FDA. And oncology, as you can see, really good about expanded access. Everybody else, not so much. GI, extremely restrictive. We have a couple great motility drugs that were taken off the market for complications with elderly adults, not statistically very relevant ones, and haven't been able to get back. And they're the only treatment for people with disabling things. So it's frustrating. I think that's going to get worse because the current administration has very unreliable guidance, and the people they put in charge are firm believers in only one form of study design. And that's one of the things that Dr. Prasad is very known for, a belief that the RCT is the only acceptable study in any context. So I think it'll be interesting to see how this develops, but I'm excited to talk about it.
I'm going to go through this one quickly because I have ALS examples that I think will be more compelling since we just watched this video. But how many people have heard of aducanumab? Okay, so aducanumab is, I think, the best case study for accelerated approval gone wrong. So this was a monoclonal antibody, the first to get accelerated approval for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. It was studied in 2 pivotal trials. They were stopped early for futility, right? Even if you kept the trials going, you were not going to see that these products were beneficial to patients. But the company, Biogen, went back through the data in post hoc analyses, always dangerous, and found in one subgroup in one of the studies, there seemed to be a benefit. And across both studies, there was clear reduction in amyloid plaque. This was a surrogate endpoint that had not previously been used to support the approval of drugs for Alzheimer's disease, right? So not a validated endpoint, and quite controversial about whether it's even reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. FDA can rely on advisory committees of external experts to give them advice when they come up with these kind of challenging approval decisions. So they don't have to listen to the advisory committee. It's truly just advice. So they called an advisory committee and they said, what do you think about aducanumab based on these data, as I've just shared them with you? And the advisory committee basically said, no way, and you're not considering accelerated approval, right? And FDA said, right, and then went on and granted accelerated approval to this drug on the basis of the reduction in amyloid plaques, and very heavily pointed to patient advocacy as a reason why they granted approval, where Alzheimer's patients and families were saying, we haven't had any good treatment options come along, we're willing to accept the uncertainty about this drug, let us have at it. And FDA said, okay, we'll let you have at it. Critical mistake for Biogen was that they originally set the price of the drug at $56,000 a year. Probably wouldn't have even raised an eyebrow for rare disease, but Alzheimer's affects so many people that they actually had to increase the premiums for Medicare because of how many people were potentially eligible to have access to this drug. Biogen subsequently cut the price in half, but it was too late. Because the evidence was so poor, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services pushed back and said, we're not paying for this unless you're in a trial. And ultimately, because other monoclonal antibodies came on the market after aducanumab, Biogen decided to withdraw aducanumab from the market. Leqembi, or lecanemab, was an alternative monoclonal antibody. It did meet its endpoints. However, the controversy about lecanemab is that it's an example of one of those drugs that met its endpoints, but the difference kind of in improvement in score, or maybe it wasn't improvement in score, maybe it was just failure to, it slowed the decline, I think, in the score, was so imperceptible that patients and clinicians might not even see it, right? It might not be clinically beneficial.
Yeah, and I think, and you kind of were polite about some of the side effects. So Aduhelm is extremely dangerous and results in what honestly in the paper sounds like someone's brain exploding, but very bad, very severe bleeds with no memory benefit. But it turned out to be a fabulous experiment for understanding Alzheimer's, which is not caused by plaques, because they got rid of those plaques and it didn't do anything. So I think there was scientific benefit there, but obviously the justification for EAP was challenging, especially with the side effect profile, which was quite bad.
Let's get to some of the ALS examples here. Okay, so this is AMX35. You heard about this in the video. And so this was developed by a company called Amylyx, and they did a phase 2 placebo-controlled randomized trial of this product, which is a combination product, actually. If I understood things correctly, you could get an off-label prescription from your doctor for one component, and you could go on Amazon and pay a bunch of money for the other component. But they put it together, they sought FDA approval, and in their phase 2 RCT, they were able to demonstrate statistically significant slowing of clinical decline. And then they continued providing the product to patients in what's called an open label extension, right? So they had their randomized design, and then they kind of had the early start and the late start, right? Because at the end of the RCT, people who hadn't previously got it were given access to the drug. And then it looked like maybe there was some survival benefit in that open label extension period. Canada granted conditional authorization to this drug, and the European Medicines Agency said no, right? So Canada said yes, EMA said no, we want to wait till we see phase 3 data. FDA originally also said no, as you saw in the video. There was an advisory committee. They said, we don't think you should approve it just based on the phase 2. FDA was saying to the company, we want you to do a phase 3. We have some concerns. We don't find it as convincing as you do, company. And the ALS patient advocacy community pushed back very hard and said, wait a minute, like Canada has it. We've got a phase 2 that met its clinical endpoint. What are you waiting for? In a rare move, FDA called a second advisory committee, which almost never happens. And at that second advisory committee meeting, the head of the neurology division said to the company CEOs, if we grant approval to this drug, do you promise that you'll do your phase 3? And if the phase 3 doesn't pan out, you will voluntarily withdraw the drug. And the company said, we will do what's right for patients. Something like that, right? They didn't like pinky swear or sign in blood or anything that they would pull the drug. This was an opportunity for the US to free ride on the EMA because the sponsors were definitely going to get the phase 3 done because EMA was requiring it. So FDA went on and they granted regular approval to AMX 0035. And the company went on to do their phase 3 study, and this is what happened. The phase 3 study did not confirm benefit. The company was true to its word and rapidly, voluntarily withdrew the product from the market. So I think the question for you and for all of you is, do you think FDA made the right decision in granting approval in the first place? Is this a success story or is it a failure?
So I agree with that. I do think it's a success. One of the big contrasts for me for this versus Aduhelm is both, they're both severe, horrible diseases. They are diseases that wreck lives, are universally, essentially fatal, and are just unpleasant things. But there are both differences in terms of the quality of data available up front and differences in terms of the side effect profile that warrant different consideration. And for me, you're seeing something that is essentially available over the counter in its separate form that has just been better. You get evidence that this is the actual product you think it is. If you buy it from a drug company, you know what the concentration is, you know exactly how much you're taking.
And your insurance can cover it.
And your insurance can cover it. And the only real downside of Roverio was that it tasted awful, and it came in a liquid, so they had to drink it. But this seems exactly like what you would want to see. It was able to get out there. If it did have the effect that was seen in the phase 2, you would have bought thousands of people months of life. And if it doesn't, it didn't. They're basically in the same place that they were before. So you're looking at a wildly different set of side effects, and what I would call for is more standardization in context, in looking at context, both the seriousness of the illness and the side effect profile that you see, because you get all that from the phase 1 to a good extent. You'll have a decent idea of how dangerous something is.
I think it's a success also. And I might be an outlier amongst my FDA critic colleagues on this one. They had pretty good evidence from a phase 2 study. It was just one, right? It wasn't perfect, but we were able to hang our hats on the fact that we knew the phase 3 was going to be happening. Now, if the EMA had not required the phase 3, then I would have been more worried because it wasn't granted accelerated approval and FDA did not impose any legal obligation to do that follow-up study. So that would have made me nervous. But I think here we kind of had really the perfect scenario would have been it worked, right? But we had the scenario in which it looked really promising. They let people have access. The company followed up as they were supposed to, and then they withdrew it when it turned out not to be beneficial.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Did those phase 2 trials include patients from around the world, or were they only in the U.S.?
Do you know the answer to that? I don't actually.
The Roverio trial was in the U.S. and Canada. It was in North America.
Because I'm curious about scenarios where internationally they may sort of say one thing about clinical trials and have a decision that may influence FDA's approach to things.
I mean, Holly can speak to this more, but historically the FDA is not that interested in everyone else's opinion, and generally says they'll make up their own mind. That has resulted in the Europeans taking the same approach about the FDA generally, but lots of other countries do use FDA guidance as an adequate basis to allow drugs.
Because I'm sure it has an impact on patients and their sort of leverage in advocating for something.
Yeah, FDA is first to approve the vast majority of drugs around the world, right? So sometimes you hear concerns, FDA is too slow, and sure, it might be too slow compared to whatever baseline, but it's not slower than EMA or the Japanese regulators or the Canadian regulators in most instances. It was slower than Canada in this particular instance. Here's another ALS example. This is the gene, it came up in the video, the SOD1 gene that Chris Snow had, and this was the drug that Chris was in the trial for, tofersen, another Biogen product. This was an antisense oligonucleotide for a particular rare mutation of ALS, and it was ultimately approved. They had a phase 3 trial and an open label extension, but they missed the primary clinical endpoint in that study. However, they were able to see that the drug was reducing neurofilament light, which is an unvalidated surrogate endpoint, had never been previously used to support an accelerated approval for ALS, and this was the very first accelerated approval for this disease. The price, is fairly high, but I don't think it's gotten much pushback on that for that reason. But I think this one has been less controversial than AMX35. If you speak to the neurology community, they seem pretty confident that this one works, even though it missed its primary endpoint. And the reason that I hear people often share is that this study was only evaluating the clinical endpoint over a period of 6 months, and the drug just needs longer to actually see a clinical impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's that, and just the challenge of heterogeneity in the ALS population, especially fast-moving. If you catch somebody 2 months after diagnosis and catch them 3 months after diagnosis, they could be in a very different clinical state. But it becomes very challenging to recruit, especially for a group that's a small percentage of the overall ALS population, if you don't allow for a little bit of variation in when they were diagnosed. And this can just also make a 6-month window very challenging. What has been observed in clinical practice is that this generally does work. It works variably for different people. It's unclear why, and it probably suggests a little bit more complicated regulation of the genetic pathway than we understand.
The other thing I'll point out about this one in the 6-month point is this is related to the idea of not having time to wait. So there has been movement in the ALS patient advocacy community to rate clinical trials based on their kind of patient friendliness, and one of the criterion is length of the placebo-controlled period. And so there's been a push for no more than 6 months before an open label extension. And my worry about that is if it takes longer to see clinical benefit, you end up putting FDA in this challenging position, whereas, for example, if this study was run for a year, I don't know that FDA would have wavered the way they did, waffled the way they did. Hypothesis, right?
I mean, to me, what that creates is a desire to be able to get expanded access at a positive endpoint in a shorter time frame while continuing for an open label extension after that. And I think that also addresses some of the issues of who pays for things, because you just route people into an open label and then add the expanded access patients into that data pool because they're roughly getting the same thing. What is challenging is that, only recently have they been allowed to have platform trials in ALS. So oncology uses this all the time, right? There's national platforms where you get tried on different constellations of drugs, different protocols. ALS, you couldn't do that. If you were on one drug that was experimental, you're done. And if you only are going to live 2 years, you're done. And so you are only recently have there been a Healy platform trial, which is based out of MGH, and it's because the FDA wouldn't accept it. But we've had the statistical ability to disentangle platform trials for quite some time now, and it's really that they aren't as good as a standalone RCT, and that is true, they're not. But they are an option that's available for patients who otherwise have essentially maybe one shot at a trial, if that.
Okay. I know we're almost out of time, but let me, very briefly, this one is another recent controversial accelerated approval. This is for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, the first gene therapy in that context. And basically what happened here was the trial did show that it improved the unvalidated surrogate, but it missed the clinical endpoint. Peter Marks, who I showed before, nonetheless granted accelerated approval for a small subpopulation of 4 to 5-year-olds. The confirmatory study was almost done at the point the accelerated approval was granted. It was completed, I think, just a couple of months later, and it didn't show, it didn't hit its primary endpoints. And so the FDA reviewers said, we don't think this drug should be approved, and Peter Marks overruled the scientific reviewers and granted full approval to a very wide indication for this therapy, which is, I think, particularly important to point out that as a gene therapy, since this might be like a once in a lifetime opportunity, depending on the vector. There are other products in development, and so this is a very difficult decision for a parent to make. Do we go forth with this gene therapy that doesn't have great evidence, or do we wait for another one that might be better? And the other thing I'll just kind of point out here is that there has been at least one patient death of a child who received this gene therapy.
Yeah, and what Holly's mentioned there is that a lot of the ways it's getting a little different now with CRISPR, but the classical ways we put genes in often use the same site, which means you put one in this case, I believe it's using an adeno-associated viral vector, so it goes to chromosome 17. And you get one shot at that, basically. And so there is a problem. This is not the right thing, and this doesn't even fully fix things. It kind of converts you to Becker's. Is that enough? Could we fully cure this next time around? And Duchenne's patients live longer than ALS patients. They will live to be in their 20s and 30s. So you could arguably have time, or you could look at it the other way, whereas if you catch somebody early and convert them to a much less severe version, you might provide them decades of a better quality of life and life in general. I'm not as sure about this one, and I think it's really challenging. I think the big gap that keeps coming up in this is not necessarily do we need more flexibility, because we have that. It's does there need to be an enforcement pathway to force removal afterwards? Can we, what can we do to kind of have discretion about severe cases and relatively benign side effect profiles? And I will say for all this, it's relatively, it's not out of helm, which was quite bad. And where do we say this is too much? And I think we do need to involve patients a little more in that process, and I don't think it's been a negative that they have been pushing for these things, as long as there are appropriate responses to prevent it from becoming widespread. And the other thing I would say is relevant is sort of the difference between, I do believe in an RCT for a trial of a drug that's going to be taken by millions of people. I believe that we should have the highest level of safety standards there, because we're talking about a potential harm that's quite high. But if you're talking about a rare disease, especially one that's universally fatal, and you have something where this might kill you, the exposure of people to that is not that high. And so it does seem to be a slightly different choice. Instead of letting some individuals make a choice for millions of people who might be impacted and give their kid cough syrup that has morphine in it and kill them, you are making a choice for 500 people a year to take some risk. And I think you're just, as a government, that your perspective needs to be a little bit on that.
I know we're out of time. Let me just really quickly share with you this point. Okay, so this is Greg Gonzalez. He's now a professor at Yale, but he was very active in ACT UP, the HIV advocacy movement. And he has become a friend to the ALS patient advocate community, but also has kind of pushed them to say, wait a minute, you're drawing some of the wrong lessons from the HIV advocacy movement. First of all, they were dealing with a much different FDA. They were dealing with an FDA that was not flexible. We are now dealing with a very flexible FDA, at least in some areas. And the concern, right, that Greg raises, I think rightly so, is that we need access and answers. Like we need both of them. We can't just push for immediate access and throw caution to the wind. And I guess where I'll close is just using your analogy. Right, you have a burning down house, you've got a bunch of buckets, and you don't know what's in them, right? Some of them are going to be water, some of them are going to make things worse, some of them are going to just, not touch the fire at all. What we need to do is make sure that we are holding companies to a standard where in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, we don't just still have a bunch of buckets that we don't know what are in them, but we have buckets that we know these things are going to be effective. And that's the government's responsibility to help make sure that we're producing the right incentives.
I guess, so,
You gotta talk about the mic so they can record it.
so just to talk about that a little bit more. And I think Dr. Wallach touched on this a little bit. So when you're talking about drugs that are used to treat diseases or conditions that millions or billions of people have, like for instance asthma or blood pressure, and it's you have another medication, for instance, that might control blood pressure better or might increase lifespan or morbidity and mortality. Doing all of that testing to make sure that the right bucket is there for patients to come 5 years down the line makes all the sense. But when there's 5 houses instead of 500 or 500,000 or whatever, and those 5 houses might burn today, you need to then think about whether you want to risk it for those 5 houses versus for 10 houses 4 years later.
Yeah, so there definitely is like a tension between the current and future patients. That's why I'm all for let's figure out ways to get patients access before approval, right, through the expanded access pathway. Let's make sure that can work in a way that it hasn't always worked. And let's recognize the flexibility that FDA is already exerting rather than saying, throw it all away. The examples that I didn't get to here, but this is the one, you might not agree with me on this one. This would be good to talk through further. When people say FDA needs to be more flexible, my response is often, what good drugs do you think FDA is refusing to approve? You might say the Amylyx drug. You probably have other examples.
I have domperidone. I'm really mad about it.
Yeah, right. So you might have examples outside neurodegenerative disease, and you might say the Amylyx drug should have been approved sooner, and then maybe we would have figured it out sooner or something. But these are two that have been in the news. This one's just recently been in the news because they missed their PDUFA date, the deadline that FDA was supposed to make their decision on. Barth syndrome is an extremely rare metabolic disorder. This is a company that we haven't even talked at all about kind of the industry incentives to work in rare disease, which is a huge issue, right? So the company basically said, we're out of money. FDA approved the drug or we're throwing in the towel. We can't afford to do any more studies. But the study they did was a randomized controlled trial in 12 people. Then they had, which is fine, right? It's a super rare disease. Yeah. I actually don't know if it's fine statistically, but I wouldn't object to it, but it is fine.
More.
They did an open label extension, and then they did a natural history controlled study with the same people who were in the original study. Okay, so it's not like they were doing 2 studies, and they didn't meet their endpoints. The open label extension was hard to interpret for a variety of reasons. FDA wasn't convinced by the natural history study either, all sorts of biases. We don't know what FDA is going to do with that drug, but this is not only is it not a slam dunk, but the evidence just really doesn't seem very strong that this is a beneficial product. And the company said, grant us approval and we'll keep studying it. But it's not that there are too few patients, because if that were the case, they wouldn't even be able to study it after approval, right? It really just is a financial challenge. That is something we haven't yet figured out, right? FDA holds up the statutory standard, I think, appropriately, regardless of whether the company can afford it or not. Because think about all the examples where companies would say, sorry, we just can't afford to do it, and we have to kind of hold them to that standard. Neuron came up in the video as well, right? If you go back and look at the FDA advisory committee meeting for that drug, this is the first opportunity that the public had to see the data. Normally, FDA has to hold in confidence the materials that get submitted, but they can share it for advisory committee. FDA eviscerated the data for Neuron, right? Like the statisticians, the clinical reviewers, they basically just said, you've said this, this, and this. We're not seeing it across the board. And you've pointed out that there could be some people who are benefiting, but FDA is not requiring 100% efficacy, right? That's not their standard, but they weren't even seeing it in subgroups in the data that were presented.
No, the problem Neuron had is that Neuron makes most people who take it worse. And then there were 3 cases of people who it definitely made better. And there's no real way to pull that out, and the company did a bad job studying it, so they couldn't really identify why. And ALS is such a heterogeneous disease, it's kind of just like, yeah, you had something that worked on this and didn't work on anything else, and otherwise was pro-inflammatory. So it is tricky, and I think it also highlights one of the challenges that was mentioned, which is just the space is very iffy for financial return. So big companies don't always get into it, and small companies can flame out in the middle of these trials, which is also why Neuron's trial wasn't that good, because it's an expensive drug to make and administer, and they didn't have enough money to get enough people, despite actually having enough people trying to be in it. But I will kind of just talk about what you said, Shah, and say I agree with you, and I think that we have an overly paternalistic response to shady behavior that is endemic to the United States and everywhere in terms of overselling drugs. But I do think it's worthwhile to consider that everyone has a different perspective on what their severity is. And so there's ALS, which is, everyone dies. But what do you do and how do you tell someone where you're going to say you can't have this IBS drug to somebody who's disabled or somebody who has chronic fatigue syndrome and has a totally wrecked life but isn't going to die of it? So can they have a drug that might kill them? And that is a hard question and not one that I think has a clear answer. And the problem is we can face these things individually, but the government and the regulatory environment has to try to create systems to approach it. And where I think we really fall down is we do not have systems to consider context. There is no weighting for how severe a disease is. There's no weighting for the severity of side effects. We treat everything the same if the side effect is mild nausea or brain explosion. And that part doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The only part that really gets separated out at is at the end, where someone like Peter Marks can decide to approve something if he thinks it's justified. And it's not part of the system. And my big flaw is that I think we need to incorporate that. And we need to educate everybody about things like early access, because as you can see, nobody uses it. And there's probably a lot of times that we would do it. Okay. But I think with that...
The only last thing, I'm just going to get one last word in, which is if you throw FDA away, some other gatekeeper is going to step in. And we saw that with aducanumab, right? So the FDA fell down on the job, let a product on the market that really shouldn't have been there, and the payer said, we're not paying for it. And payers are only going to pay for things that have some reasonable plausibility of safety and effectiveness, and that's appropriate. It's a shared resource, right? And even for rare disease, these things cost money, and there are opportunity costs associated with that.
It also didn't hurt that most of the neurologists were like, absolutely not, I'm not prescribing that, because it's very dangerous and provided no benefit. But thank you guys for sticking around.
Yeah, thanks for your attention.